Hey, my name is Marcus Webb. I'm 29 years old, and I run a letterpress machine at a print shop called Holloway & Sons on the east side of Crestfield, Ohio, a mid-sized city that has been in the process of becoming something else for about 20 years without finishing the job. Most people, when I tell them what I do, have a version of the same reaction. They didn't know letterpress was still a thing. It is. It's a small thing. The commercial side of the industry is a fraction of what it was before offset printing took over in the 50s. But there's a market for it now in the craft space. Wedding invitations, fine stationery, limited edition book covers. Specialty packaging for companies that want their product to feel substantial in someone's hands. The work is slow and physical, and requires a particular kind of attention that most people don't have the patience for anymore, which is probably why there are fewer of us every year. What I operate is called a platen press, a Chandler and Price from 1936 that weighs about 1,500 pounds and has been running in the Holloway shop since before the current owner's father was born. The press works by bringing a flat plate of type against a flat sheet of paper with precise pressure. Too little and the impression is ghost light, barely visible. Too much and you crush the paper fibers, collapse the type, leave a bruise instead of a mark. The right pressure leaves an impression you can feel with your fingertip, a clean, even indent that tells you the plate and the paper made contact in exactly the right way, at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right force. Getting that right takes time. Every job is different. Paper weight, ink viscosity, plate depth, humidity in the shop. You set the press, run a test sheet, read the impression, adjust, run another. You do this until the test sheet tells you everything is registered and the impression is even from corner to corner. Then, you run the job. If you rush the setup, you waste paper and ink and time. If you're patient with the setup, the job runs clean. I work Tuesday through Saturday, 8 to 4, in a shop that smells like machine oil and solvents and the particular dry smell of old paper. There are 4 of us. Mr. Holloway, who is 71 and does the design and client work from a back office. Dennis, who runs the offset machine and the binding equipment and has been there for 22 years. Petra, who handles orders and scheduling in front of house, and me. I've been there for 6 years, which is long enough that Mr. Holloway trusts me alone in the shop on Saturdays when he has better things to do, and long enough that I know Dennis's moods by which radio station he's playing. My days are quiet in the workshop way, physically occupied, mentally present. The kind of work where an hour passes and you don't notice it because you were inside something. I eat lunch at the bench if I'm in the middle of a job. I walk home in the evenings. The shop is 12 blocks from my apartment, and I walk it regardless of weather, because it's the 20 minutes in my day that belong to nothing. I cook dinner, eat it at the counter most nights, watch whatever's on. I go to bed too late and wake up at 6:15, having slept well enough. It's a life without complaint. I don't mean that as a diminishment. I just mean I'd stopped looking for the things I used to look for when I was younger and more certain I knew what I wanted. There'd been a woman in my mid-20s, Denise, who I'd been with for almost 2 years. And when it ended with the particular plainness of 2 people who realized they had been very good at being in the same room without actually getting closer. She said, "I don't think you know how to let someone in, Marcus. I thought about that for a long time." I still think she was mostly right. After Denise, I went to work and came home and went back to work, and the weeks arranged themselves into months and the months into years, and none of it felt like loss exactly. More like maintenance, like keeping a press in running condition when there's no job scheduled. Oil it, clean it, make sure everything moves freely. Against the day when something needs printing. That's the life I was living in April. when Crestfield got its first real spring day after a long gray winter, and I walked into the shop on a Tuesday morning and found out there was a new hire. Her name was June Calloway. She'd come from a paper goods company in Columbus that had downsized its in-house production, and she had 4 years of letterpress experience, which in this field is significant, and Mr. Holloway had hired her for a 3-day week to handle the overflow that had been backing up since Dennis threw out his back in February. She was sitting at the second bench when I came in, reading the spec sheet for the job that had been staged the night before, and she looked up when I came through the door. She had light brown hair cut short, slightly grown out so it was at the stage of length where it didn't have a clean shape yet, and she was wearing a canvas apron that was clearly her own, old, broken in, the kind you bring from a previous job because the fit has been worked into it. She had ink on the heel of her right hand already, which meant she'd been in early. There were 2 test sheets on the bench beside her, which meant she'd been running setups before 8 o'clock on her first day. She looked at me with a level, matter-of-fact expression that was not unfriendly but was also not performing anything. She said, "Marcus?" "Yeah," I said. "June," she said. I pulled the Hartwell job from staging because the spec said morning deadline. I hope that's okay. I looked at the test sheets. The impression was even. The registration was clean. "More than okay," I said. She went back to the spec sheet. I went to my bench. Dennis came in at 8:30 and introduced himself, and she nodded and went back to work, which Dennis later told me was the right instinct. That was the beginning of it. Or the beginning of what I noticed, which is not always the same thing. The thing about working in a small shop with someone who is good at the same thing you are is that you can't hide it. The work is either right or it isn't, and everyone in the room can see the test sheets. June was precise in the way that real experience makes you precise, not careful in the nervous sense, but economical. She didn't over-adjust. She read an impression once and made one change and ran another test sheet, whereas I had known people to chase an adjustment in circles for an hour because they were correcting their corrections. She also cleaned her press when she was done with a job, which sounds like a low bar, but isn't, in my experience, in practice. I noticed these things without making a point of noticing them, which is different from not noticing. We worked alongside each other on the same bench for the first 2 weeks, without much conversation beyond the job at hand. Which plate went where? Whether the bone folder was on my side or hers. If I'd seen the backing sheets for the Mercer order. The shop has a particular quality in the mornings, before Dennis arrives and the radio starts. Just the sound of the presses, the squeak of the rolling ink, the thump of the platen on the downstroke. June moved through that quiet without disturbing it, which was something I appreciated and did not say. The first real conversation happened on a Thursday in May. I was running a test sheet for a stationery job, cream cotton paper, deep blue ink, a client monogram, and the impression kept coming out heavier on the left side, which usually means packing adjustment, and I'd adjusted twice and was staring at the third test sheet trying to decide if it was better or if I was only seeing what I wanted to see. She came to stand beside me and looked at the sheet. She said, "It's better, but the plate's slightly low on the left, not the packing." I looked at it again. She was right. I'd been chasing the symptom instead of the source. "Torque on the chase clamp," she said. "Yeah," I said. "Happens on this press," she said. I looked up the model when I started. The clamp runs loose over time. I looked at her. "You looked it up. I like knowing what I'm working with before I work with it," she said, and went back to her bench. I fixed the clamp. The impression came out even on the first test sheet after. I looked at it for a moment and thought about the 4 adjustments I'd made before she said anything, each one addressing the wrong thing because I hadn't looked at the source. That evening I walked home through the new warmth of a May evening and I thought about the way she'd said it. Not showing off. Not even particularly noticing that she'd helped. Just stating a fact and returning to her work. Because in her version of events, it was a small thing, and the job needed to get done. I went home and ate dinner at the counter, and the apartment was quiet. And the quiet had a different quality to it than it usually did. Not worse. Just more noticeable. By June, I knew the following things about her. She made her coffee in a small French press she kept in her bag and washed at the sink every morning. Because the shop's drip machine, in her assessment, produced something that tasted like hot intention, with no follow-through. She had strong opinions about paper. She could identify the manufacturer of most cotton stocks by touch, and had views on which ones took ink better at which humidity levels that she shared if asked, and not otherwise. She read during lunch, but not fiction. Mostly history. Mostly about things being built. Bridges, aqueducts, the postal system. Things that required someone to figure out how to move something from one place to another reliably and at scale. I knew that she walked to work from the other direction. I'd seen her twice coming down the cross street, which meant she lived somewhere in the Alderman neighborhood. Probably the north end of it, judging by the angle of approach. I knew she had a younger brother, because she'd mentioned him once, briefly in the context of a phone call she'd stepped outside to take, and when she came back she'd said, "Sorry, family," and then said nothing else, and nobody asked. I knew she didn't talk much about Columbus except when someone brought up a printing technique, and she'd say we did it differently there and explain the difference, which was always interesting, and always came with the slight flatness of someone describing a place they'd left before they were ready. I did not know why she'd left. I didn't ask. I had the sense it wasn't a simple story, and that she would tell it when she decided to, and not before. What I knew about how I felt about all of this, I did not examine directly. It was like looking at a test sheet and choosing not to read the impression, because if the impression was off, you'd have to stop and make adjustments. I kept the thought at the edge of my attention and did the work that needed doing. The shift request happened in the 3rd week of June. I was cleaning my press after a run, which takes about 20 minutes when I do it right, and she came and stood at the edge of my bench and said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," I said. "Would you cover my Saturday?" She looked at the press rather than at me while she said it, which was unusual. She was the kind of person who looked at you when she spoke. "I have something I need to do. I wouldn't ask if it was optional. Saturday was my day to have the shop to myself, which I'd liked for 6 years. It also meant overtime, because Saturdays ran at time and a half. "What job's on for Saturday?" I asked. "The Finch wedding order. 450 cards, 2 plates, blind deboss on the reverse. It's a long run." "I know the Finch job," I said. I set the plates. "I know," she said. She was still looking at the press. "I'll take a Monday for you whenever you want it." "You don't have to do that," I said. She looked at me then, briefly. "Okay," she said. "Thank you." She picked up the spec sheet she'd been holding and went back to her bench, and that was that. I covered the Saturday. The Finch job ran clean, my setup was good, and the press ran well, and I was done by 2. I cleaned up and locked the shop, and walked home, and spent the rest of the afternoon doing nothing in particular, thinking occasionally about whatever it was she'd needed to do, and whether she was okay. She came in Monday morning with a French press full of coffee and 2 cups, which she had not done before. She set 1 cup on my side of the bench, without a word. I looked at it. "Thank you for Saturday," she said. "How was your thing?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the order on her bench. "I had to go back to Columbus," she said, "just for the day, to get some things from the apartment. My ex had been—" She stopped, looked at the order, started again. He kept saying he needed more time before we could divide up the shared stuff. He'd been saying that for 4 months. She said it evenly, the way she said most things. I stopped waiting for him to be ready, and I just went. "Did you get everything?" I said. "Most of it." She picked up the spec sheet. "The things that were mine." "Yes," I said. "Good." She looked at me. "Good," she agreed, and there was something in the word, something settled, like a press that's been shimmed correctly, nothing wobbling. We worked the morning side by side. Dennis came in and changed the radio to something too loud and turned it down when June looked at him, which I noted for future reference. At lunch she sat at the bench with her history book, and I ate at mine, and outside the shop the summer had arrived, and the street had the quality of a street in summer, slower, louder, the smell of it through the open side window. I looked up at some point and found her looking at me over the top of her book, and she didn't look away immediately, and neither did I. And then she went back to reading, and I went back to eating, and neither of us said anything about it. 2 days later she came to stand at my bench again while I was mixing ink, and she said, "Do you eat lunch outside, when the weather's good?" "Sometimes," I said. "There's a bench on Pryor Street." "I know the bench," she said. "I've been eating there on Wednesdays." "Have you?" I said. "Yes," she said. "It occurred to me that you might too." She picked up a gauge from my bench, looked at it, set it back. "I'm not saying we should make it a thing. I'm just saying the information. I'll be there Wednesday," I said. "Okay," she said. She was already there when I got to the bench on Wednesday, with her book open and a sandwich that she clearly made herself. None of the deli packaging the rest of us carried. We ate and we talked, and the conversation moved the way conversations move when two people have been in the same room long enough to have a shared context, which makes it easy. The Finch job. The particular way Dennis sighed when he got an order he didn't like. Mr. Holloway's habit of appearing in the workshop doorway to observe silently, and then disappearing without comment. She was funny about all of it. Not unkind, she wasn't a mean person, but exact, and her exactness applied to comedy the way it applied to everything else. She told me about letterpress in Columbus, how the company had run it as a prestige line inside a larger commercial shop, which meant the letterpress team always felt slightly separate from the main operation. Not unwanted, but adjacent, like a specialty department, she said. You got to do interesting work, but nobody above you really understood what you were doing, so the decisions about your resources were made by people who thought of it as a side project. She looked at the street. That's a fine way to treat a hobby. It's a bad way to treat a craft. Is that why you left? I said. She was quiet for a moment. Partly, she said. The other part isn't about the job. I didn't push. She knew I hadn't pushed. She looked at me briefly with an expression that was something between appreciation and assessment, something that recognized a quality and was deciding what to do with having recognized it. Why did you stay? She asked. At Holloway's. 6 years is a long time. The press, I said. It was the most honest answer. That specific machine. It's been running since 1936, and it's never been rebuilt, and it runs better than machines half its age, and I think about all the people who have run jobs on it, what they printed, who it was for, whether they knew they were making something that would last. I stopped, feeling like I'd said more than I meant to. And it's quiet, I said. The work is quiet. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, I like that answer. We walked back to the shop together, and neither of us mentioned the bench again, but we were both there the following Wednesday, and the one after that. The Wednesdays accumulated into something. Not a routine, exactly, more like a standing agreement between two people who had decided not to name what they were agreeing to. She always brought her own food, I started bringing mine instead of buying from the cart on Carver Street, which was a decision I made one Tuesday evening and didn't examine. We talked about the work, and then about other things, and the other things got further from the shop and more toward the actual material of our lives. The way conversations do when people stop performing caution and start just talking. She told me in pieces about the 4 years in Columbus, the relationship, which had started well and then slowly adjusted to accommodate his needs, and then continued adjusting until she was running entirely on his calendar, his preferences, his version of what they were doing. She said it plainly, as fact, the flat tone of someone who has already processed the anger and is left with the clear shape of what happened. He wasn't cruel, she said. He had a strong sense of how things should go, and I kept trying to fit into it, and one day I looked at the work I was doing and the apartment I was living in and the version of myself that showed up in that apartment, and I didn't recognize the last one. She looked at the street. The job ending was the first good thing that happened to me in about 18 months. It gave me a reason to move that wasn't only about leaving him. I said, "You don't have to have a reason that makes sense to anyone else." She looked at me. "No," she said. "But I needed one that made sense to me." She paused. "I'm still figuring out what those are, the ones that make sense to you." Yes, she looked at her book without reading it. For a long time, the ones that made sense to me were the ones he approved of, and I confused that for agreement. It wasn't. It was just compression. She said the word like she'd found it recently and was still testing its fit. I got compressed down to what he needed me to be, and I thought that was being practical. It took me a year to understand it as a loss. The bench on Pryor Street was between a dry cleaner and a shoe repair shop, and it got afternoon shade from the building across the street in summer, and the street was quiet enough for conversation without being so quiet that silence felt exposed. I had eaten lunch there alone, on and off, for 3 years. I thought about that. 3 years of the same bench, the same angle of shade, and how it had not occurred to me that there might be a better use for it until she said the information, as she'd called it. I just wanted to say the information. I said, "I lived with someone when I was 25. Denise. She told me when she left that she didn't think I knew how to let someone in." I looked at the street. I've thought about it a lot since. I think what she meant was that I was present but not available. Like a shop that's open, but the good inventory's in the back, and you don't show it unless someone specifically asks. She was quiet for a moment. "Are you showing it now?" she asked. Not provocatively, genuinely. "I think so," I said. "I'm not sure I'd know how to tell." She looked at me. "I can tell," she said, and went back to her book. I walked back to the shop that afternoon, and the press was where it always was, and Dennis had the radio on the afternoon jazz station, which meant he was in a good mood, and Mr. Holloway was in his office, doing whatever Mr. Holloway did in his office, and June was at her bench reading a spec sheet, and I stood at mine and looked at the job staged for the afternoon and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the inventory was in the right place. The thing about getting the setup right on a letterpress job is that you can feel when it's right before you run the test sheet. There's a quality to the way the press settles into the impression, a solidity, a rightness, that you develop a sense for after years of getting it wrong first. You stop second-guessing it when you learn to trust what you already know. I knew something about June that I had been not reading the way I'd not read that test sheet in May. I knew it the way you know a plate is registered before the paper makes contact, by the evidence of everything surrounding the moment, by the quality of the air in the room, by the way an hour with her passed at a different speed than an hour without her, and I'd stopped pretending not to notice. There was a Thursday evening toward the end of July when we both stayed late, not for a rush job, just because the regular job ran long and we both decided to finish it rather than leave it staged overnight. Dennis had gone home at 4:30 and Mr. Holloway at 5, and by 6:15 it was just the two of us and the press and the low light coming through the high windows. She was collating the finished sheets into sets, and I was doing a final run of the third plate. And at some point the radio on Dennis's side of the shop ran out of whatever station he'd left it on and went to static, and neither of us turned it off, and the shop went quiet, except for the press. She finished the collating and came to stand at the edge of my station and watched me run the last 20 cards. She did this sometimes. Watched the press work from a particular angle, the angle where you could see the platen come down and the paper make contact, see the impression happen in real time. She told me once that she found it easier to understand a problem in someone else's press than in her own, because when it was hers, she was too close to it. I ran the last card. She looked at it. "Even," she said. "Even." I agreed. We stood in the quiet shop and I pulled the plate and she started breaking down the ink, and neither of us said anything for a while, and the nothing we said wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that has been built up through months of working alongside someone and learning the particular rhythm of them, and it was comfortable in the way that only things you've earned are comfortable. She said, without looking up from the ink roller, "Can I ask you something personal?" "Yes," I said. "Denise," she said, the thing she said, about not letting someone in. She was cleaning the roller in smooth, even strokes. "Do you think that's still true?" I thought about it. "I think I got better at it and then stopped practicing," I said. "Like a skill that goes dormant." She was quiet for a moment. What would it take to practice again? I looked at her. She was still focused on the roller, but there was a particular quality to the focus, the kind that is more listening than looking. "Someone worth practicing for," I said. She set the roller down and looked at me then, directly, with those level eyes, and I looked back, and what passed between us in that moment I couldn't have said out loud. It was the impression before the test sheet, the sense of two things that have been moved into position and are waiting for the pressure to confirm what they already know. Then she said, "I'll finish up here." And I said okay, and we finished up separately, and I walked home and the 12 blocks went by without me registering a single one of them. What I didn't know was whether she'd say it first or whether I'd have to. She was careful, the way careful people are, not withholding, but precise about what she offered and when. I had learned enough about her to know that the Columbus situation had not been a small thing, that she'd spent months in a relationship that compressed her until she stopped recognizing herself, and then 4 more months waiting for an ex who kept asking her to wait, and that she had finally stopped waiting and driven there herself and taken back what was hers. I understood that someone who had done that was not going to rush into anything. I didn't want to rush. I just wanted to know if we were heading somewhere, or if I was the only one who thought we were. I didn't ask. I told myself I was reading the impression. What I was actually doing was running adjustments on the wrong variable because I was afraid to look at the source. That changed on the last Friday of July. We had a late job, a rush order that came in at 2 o'clock for a 100-card print run that a client needed by Monday, and Mr. Holloway had apologized, but asked if anyone could stay, and Dennis couldn't, and Petra was leaving for a weekend with her family, and June and I both said we'd stay. Mr. Holloway left at 4:30 with real gratitude, and the shop settled into the particular quiet of after hours, which is different from regular hours quiet. Denser. More yours. We worked through it. She ran the press while I mixed a second ink batch, and I ran the second pass while she cleaned the first plate, and we didn't talk much, because the work had its own rhythm, and disrupting it would have slowed us down. But every so often I'd look across the bench and she'd be focused on something with that complete, unhurried attention she brought to everything. And I'd notice it and look back at what I was doing. By 7 we were done. I cleaned the press and she cleaned up her station, and we stood in the shop in the evening light coming through the high windows, gold and long, the end of July kind. And she said, "Thank you for staying." "You stayed too," I said. "I know," she said. "But you didn't have to." I looked at her. She was looking at the clean press, and then she looked at me. She said, "Can I tell you something?" "Yes," I said. She was quiet for a moment that had weight in it. Then she said, "The shift. 3 weeks ago, when I asked you to cover my Saturday." "Yeah, I did need to go to Columbus," she said. That part was true. She was still looking at me. But I could have gone Sunday. There was no reason it had to be Saturday. A pause. I asked you because I wanted you to do something for me. I wanted to see if you would. She looked down briefly. And then I wanted to thank you for it. And I've been trying to decide since whether to tell you why I asked. And today you stayed when you didn't have to, and she stopped. "I just wanted more time near you," she said, very quietly, as if the sentence was something being admitted rather than declared. That's what the Saturday was. I'm sorry if that's a strange thing to say. The shop was very still. Outside, the street had the low sound of a Friday evening. Cars, somewhere someone's radio. The far sound of the city doing what cities do. In here just the light and the smell of ink and the 1936 press that had been running since before either of us was alive. I said, "I've been walking the same 12 blocks home every evening for 3 months and thinking about you the entire way." She looked at me. "I've been adjusting the wrong variables on purpose," I said, "because the right one was the one I didn't know how to touch." I stopped. I don't have a better way to say it than that. She looked at me with the level expression she used when she was deciding whether something was true, and then she came around the end of the bench, which was 3 steps in a small shop. And she put her hand on the side of my face, just for a moment, and looked at me from close range with her direct, practiced eyes. And then she kissed me. It was brief and certain, the way her work was. No hesitation once the decision was made. She pulled back a small distance and stayed there, and I could see her reading the impression. The way we both read impressions. And what she found in it must have been right, because she kissed me again, slower this time, and the shop held the quiet of it. And the light came through the windows and lay across the floor in long gold bars, and the press stood in the corner where it had stood for 80 years. And everything was registered. Everything was even. Corner to corner. She stepped back and looked at me and said, "I've been standing at the edge of saying that for 2 months." "You should have said it," I said. "So should you," she said. "Yes," I said. She looked around the shop, the clean benches, the finished job stacked and wrapped, the light going soft toward evening. "Are you hungry?" she said. "Very," I said. She picked up her bag. "I know a place 2 streets over." She looked back at me. "It's not fancy." "Good," I said. She almost smiled the full way. "Come on then," she said. She didn't go back to the 3-day week after July. Mr. Holloway extended her to full-time in August, which nobody was surprised by, including June, who had been doing the work of a full-time person since the 3rd week. Dennis celebrated by turning the radio to a station she liked without being asked, which was Dennis's version of a speech. We didn't make a production of it at work. We were professional in the shop and ourselves everywhere else, and Mr. Holloway observed this arrangement without comment for about 6 weeks, and then said to me one afternoon, apropos of nothing, "She's good for the press," and went back to his office. and I understood that was all he needed to say, and all he was going to say. She moved out of the alderman apartment and into mine in the fall, which happened gradually and then, completely the way things do, a coffee press left behind, a box of paper stock, a history book. And then one evening she brought the canvas apron and hung it on the hook next to mine at the door. And that was that. On weekend mornings now we walk to the shop together, and she makes coffee in the French press while I open the side window, and the smell of the shop settles around us the way it always has, and we work. Sometimes we talk and sometimes we don't, and the silence between us has the quality of a press that is properly set, nothing straining against anything, just the clean contact of two things that have been adjusted to work together. I think about what I was like in the years before she walked in that April morning with her own apron already broken in, already knowing what she was working with before she worked with it. I was a press in good maintenance, running clean, running quiet, everything lubricated, everything moving freely against the day when something needed printing. The impression a letterpress leaves is not painted on the surface. It goes into the paper. You can feel it with your eyes closed, the depth of it, the pressure that was applied at exactly the right moment in exactly the right place. That's the difference between something printed and something pressed. Something pressed leaves a mark that stays. You can run your finger across it years later and still feel it, the evidence of contact. The record of a moment when two things came together with the right amount of force, and neither of them broke. She asked me to cover her shift, and I said yes, because it was practical and cost me nothing, and she came in Monday with 2 cups of coffee, and the reason behind the reason. And by the time she told me, I already knew. The way you know an impression is right before the sheet comes off the press. You learn to trust what you already know. You stop running adjustments on the wrong things. You look at the source. 026.